again there, denizens of the internet. How are my friends doing? I hope you guys are having a lovely day. It's a nice, relaxing day today here for me. And today I thought I would talk about the exact reason why modern video games suck. So I've talked about why the stories of modern video games are all trash. And so if you want to watch those episodes, it's happened multiple times. Anything relating to, my theory on the Western mythos, you can just apply to video games flat out. And if you don't know, I've said it a million times about why the modern video games suck. I think in the Dragonblight episode where I talked about Dragonblight, or Dragonflight, I mean, that would be the one where I first discussed this issue. But in this particular video, I'd like to talk about the mechanics of why the video games suck, more so than the story. Like, the story, a game can have a horrible story and still be, playable. Like, just look at Dragonflight. Even though it wasn't that good, it was playable in Season 1. Season 2, it's beyond saving, in my opinion. Dale's gonna give it a shot, but I am not. Nope. Maybe I can be convinced otherwise. I always have an open mind, but it looks garbaggio. And so, why do modern video games suck? And the reason modern video games suck, because they lack a lot of depth that these older video games used to have. You can't really get lost in a modern video game anymore. And what do I mean by lost? Because everyone who has played good video games craves that deep, nostalgic, like, it's nostalgic because it doesn't exist anymore, but intrinsic knowledge of the game, where the game basically becomes your life. And that's what people are really after, is being in situations where the game becomes your life. And for the game to become your life, it has to be more than just, a quick, storied experience, right? The game, if you want it to become your life, has to take over and be so deep that you can get lost in it. And games just don't really have that depth anymore. And so what causes that depth? What's the difference, right? And the primary difference between old games and new games, at least mechanically speaking, is the depth. Let's just look at old school RuneScape, for instance. Like, if I want to do something in this game, there's a billion different things I have to consider, have to articulate around, and there's a whole host of potential ways that I have to go about trying to play the game, trying to understand it, theorycraft it. Just look at like a game like Path of Exile, for instance, or the original Diablo, Diablo 2, Brood War, like World of Warcraft. All of these games have this deep, intrinsic way you can sort of get lost in them and sort of experience them in a unique way every single time, and there's all sorts of different routes to go about whatever you want to do. Modern video games are basically a movie. They're very quick, tailored experience where you see the explosion, you shoot the bad guy, and then you move on, right? You complete your hero's quest, you rescue the princess, what have you, and then you're on to the next castle. And the next castle is a $70 DLC, by the way. That's another aside entirely, but... So, modern video games have no depth. They're meant to be like movies instead of a video game, right? A video game is something where you're supposed to get lost in the mental maze of the mechanics of the video game. And because the mechanics are so deep and so interesting, you can theorycraft and think and associate with them just endlessly. And the vast majority of modern AAA titles just don't have that. Some indie games, Path of Exile, etc., old school RuneScape, some of these games do have these, like, places where you can lose yourself and get interested in it and have these deep, connections to characters and all of that. And that's all great that does exist. But it's extremely rare in the modern era. It's completely unheard of for the most part. And people, especially Generation Z, would much rather have their games presented to them like a movie where they show up, they get there, whatever, and then they go home. Like, just look at modern WoW, for instance. There's so many underlying, and what could be complicated systems, and they kind of mimic the old way that systems used to be, but they're also just bad systems. They're not very deep. They have an illusion of depth to them, but your choices are not really impactful. At the end of the day, you can see that it's clear it's just, a mechanism to try and get you to log into the game every single day. And that's not real depth. Like, it's not interesting. Dailies are not interesting, nor do they increase the depth of the game. And tying everything to this, player retention metric, or do this or else you'll fall so far behind you can't play the game. That's not a fun dichotomy to begin with. And yeah, it doesn't create this aspect of where it doesn't feel real. It feels like it's forced into the game, is another aspect to it. Things don't really feel real in modern video games. And what is that realness I'm talking about? I'm talking about the mechanics don't feel like they were put in there because they were fun. This wasn't designed by some white nerd in his basement, right? Like this system was designed by some diversity hire trying to emulate what the white nerd did while still bowing down to some corporate executive shill. And at the end of the day, it just leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And so, that's, you can actually take damage from these things when they fall on you. I didn't realize that until like 95 mining on the main. When I get it on my actual main, not this cute little boy right here. But yeah, so how do we bring games back to the point where they have depth in them? So it's kind of a difficult topic, right? Because what makes video games these days is, microtransactions and, forced player retention, force them to log in every single day and keep them in the game for X amount of time so your statistics look good and you can report it to the higher-ups. Wow, look at how much they've logged on, even though they disliked the experience, but we made them do it if they want to enjoy the parts of the game they enjoy. Wow, look at us, so smart. And virtually all video games are like this. I know I'm picking on WoW in particular here, but it's still fine to do that, just because screw them, heck them. And I mean, there's a million different things we can talk about, like as far as the gameplay design aspects. Like just look at the entire battle royale genre. It's literally a point and click adventure where you sometimes build stuff, or it has some unique twist, like the Fortnites or whatever the kids enjoy these days. And all of these experiences are very, vapid, very hollow, but they're put into the game just because they increase their metrics, and they're probably done by the ESG. I'm not gonna lie, but it is what it are. Recovering from this, I think, is impossible. It's just there's going to be a new type of media that comes in the future, and it might be video game-like, it might be some sort of VR version of video games, but there'll be a new type of media, and then in that new type of media, you'll have people that can experiment and make things proper again. And when they do, we'll have another gaming renaissance, but, as far as, like, trying to enjoy modern video games, you're never going to get that experience, like, for instance, in old school RuneScape and, classic WoW, or you get lost in things. Like, Modern Classic was a disaster and a joke also. It's like a downscaled Legion client. It's not the same client. It doesn't have the same feel. It never did. That is the reason I didn't even bother with it, and that was it. And when you extrapolate that to, the rest of the gaming industry, it's very clear to see why these things just don't carry any depth. They don't make memories. Like, kids these days, I feel sorry for them. Like, they're growing up with a memory of, like, Fortnite. Like, oh yeah, I won the Battle Royale once or something. And yeah, that's an alright memory, and the fidelity of the video games, the graphics, and a lot of, like, the mechanics, the whole ticks, like, that old school RuneScape is based off of, or, the old Battle.net version of their ticks, that inbuilt latency it used to have, and all across all Blizzard games, like, yeah, they don't have to deal with that anymore. They don't have to deal with adjusting to that, but that was part of the depth and part of the fun, was actually experiencing the game and working around those limitations. And it, as unrealistic as, like, a tick is, as far as, endgame gameplay mechanics, it still made the game feel like more skillful, and that interacting with it and learning to control something that was badly designed, let's be clear, compared to the fluid gameplay dynamics we have today, it still, I feel, made things more interesting. Because when you're playing, like, if you just imagine, like, RuneScape 3 versus OSRS, right? So OSRS has this inbuilt, like, latency to all the abilities. RuneScape 3, doesn't have that. It's still based on, this sort of exact, like, instant time, instant click, instant gratification type of development scheme. And the gameplay and the fights are much better because of that, right? Like, just objectively, if you're talking about what's going to be fun in RuneScape 3, it's the bossing. Why is the bossing fun? Because the game is basically built around, fighting these bosses and slaying them. And it's a lot less, exploitable like old school is. Like, in old school, you can do some fairly insane things, right? Especially with tick manipulations, and like the perfect play in RuneScape is actually ridiculous when you imagine like what an AI or what a superhuman could do to play the game and make things happen in a way that's, ultimately not even human. But going forward, I don't see any way to resolve these issues, and the only hope really is just modern games and people who understand and try and carry that flame of a game can be your life. And if a future next big thing does come, it's going to come out of the indie community. It'll get bought up by some AAA executive or someone, and then it's going to be ruined. So I wouldn't get your hopes up. I would say, you can experience something if, the big FOMO, and have an enjoyable time, and then just be prepared for it to go to total crap and then exit. But that's at least my gameplay strategy. But I can play old school RuneScape for the rest of my life, and like private servers will always exist in some form or another. So there is always hope, especially for WoW and a lot of these other things. You can still find stuff to do. You can still make goals and achieve them. So, just work on that in the future. And you have a good day, friends.